There is a timeless assertion in certain non-dual teachings that the highest truth is best conveyed through silence. Although many texts, commentaries, and discussions point toward this ultimate nature, they also consistently suggest that final realization remains beyond verbal expression. According to a profound interpretation in a branch of thought often associated with a Hindu lineage, everything that can be said, every philosophical argument, every spiritual treatise, ultimately aims to bring seekers to a point where words drop away. At that juncture, there is said to be nothing more beneficial than the silent disclosure of truth. Silence in this context has layers of meaning. On a simple level, silence can be the absence of speech, refraining from unnecessary words or harmful expressions. On a deeper level, silence can extend inward, calming the constant agitation of the mind. And on the deepest level, silence points to the inexpressible nature of the ultimate reality, a reality that cannot be contained by conceptual thought or language. Some people in these teachings observe how the entire world can be viewed as a form of continuous noise, a swirl of desires, aversions, and ceaseless chatter, while the inmost core remains utterly still and complete. A teacher in the past famously sang the praise of silence through evocative verses. In an emblematic example, the teacher placed silence itself at the apex of instruction, suggesting that the most exalted realization could never be adequately rendered into words. If the person seeking insight could not grasp the unspoken teaching, a single syllable might be offered, something considered the primordial sound that many recite in meditation. If that, too, was insufficient, a short phrase would be given, conveying that the essence of one's being and the essence of ultimate reality are not two. If even that fell short, more elaborate teachings would appear. Vast collections of writings about non-duality would eventually unfold. Yet each elaborate teaching, no matter how brilliant, was ultimately said to circle back to silence as the culminating truth. Many approaches have discussed the levels or steps on the way to that silence. One approach begins with ethics, since ethics deals with how an individual relates to the surrounding environment, other sentient beings, and oneself. When ethical conduct is in disarray, characterized by dishonesty, greed, aggression, or selfish pursuits, inner quietude remains elusive. It is as if mental turbulence constantly clouds the deeper awareness. Some statements in older texts say that unethical actions are like noise, clashing with the stillness of the mind's natural clarity. Conversely, a moral life, shaped by honesty, respect, kindness, and a sense of service, is akin to purifying the clutter. This purified foundation is sometimes described as a stage of silence, not literal muteness, but a lessening of the inner noise generated by destructive impulses. At a slightly subtler level, some reflect on how speech itself can be a source of agitation. Hurtful words, boastful claims, perpetual criticism, and dishonest statements create a dense mental atmosphere, both for the speaker and the listeners. By contrast, speech used sparingly, speaking truth when needed and refraining from worthless chatter, reduces the mind's tendency to be scattered. A well-known observation is that negative or malicious statements often end up corroding the speaker's own sense of ease, even before they affect others. Thus, by cultivating thoughtful, helpful, and compassionate language, one moves closer to an inner silence. Then, if one chooses, speech can be paused altogether at intervals, creating a direct sense of how quietness of voice begins to nourish quietness of mind. Another dimension of silence is connected with action. Many times, actions are driven by personal desires, craving for pleasure, yearning for recognition, or struggling to gain power. Such motivations can become mental noise that never allows genuine contentment. Even seemingly positive goals can turn into restlessness if they emerge solely from ambition or attachment. Some teachers suggest that a different kind of action, one free from selfish desire, brings a sense of stillness. The ancient term for selfless work can be seen as a transformation of ordinary activities into a path of silent service. Rather than fueling the mind's noise through constant craving, selfless service can paradoxically foster silence even amid outward busyness. Then comes the practice of turning inward. Here, mental processes themselves must be quieted if a person intends to discover deeper layers of stillness. Certain forms of mental negativity, such as anger, envy, or habitual complaining, are considered mental noise. Such negativity is said to pollute the heart, preventing direct recognition of the underlying peaceful nature that is always available. In order to progress, people cultivate more positive, constructive patterns of mind. This step refines mental activity into something more luminous and less self-absorbed. Finally, in many contemplative traditions, one aims to transcend even the positive patterns in favor of a state where thinking subsides without lapsing into dullness. That dimension is sometimes called pure or unwavering silence, an unbroken clarity that arises when the mental waves are stilled. The well-known yoga tradition, in a system credited to an early compiler of aphorisms, describes spiritual progress as the gradual silencing of the mind's fluctuations. The classic statement is that yoga is precisely the cessation of the modifications or waves of the mind. This analogy likens the mind to a lake. If the water is turbulent or muddy, the reflection of the sky is distorted and the bottom cannot be seen. Only when the water becomes still and transparent does it reveal the lake bed and the unclouded reflection of the heavens. Similarly, in the approach that uses sustained introspection, a person reduces the swirling patterns of distraction by focusing on a single point, often the breath, a sacred syllable, or an image representing the divine. Over time, the mind can become thoroughly calm, allowing something deeper to be perceived. Yet this calmness cannot be forced in one step. Many philosophies explain that the mind must pass from scattered attention to a single pointed focus, and then from one pointed focus to an eventual dissolving of even that focus, so that pure awareness alone remains. The process is facilitated by repeated practice and a certain letting go of attachment. Repeated practice is described by some treatises as the act of bringing the mind back again and again to the chosen center. The mind's natural restlessness drives it outward, so only by patient, continuous effort can it be gradually stilled. Likewise, letting go of attachment or cravings is essential because holding strong desires or aversions acts as an anchor that keeps the boat tied to the shore of agitation. Unless that anchor is lifted, the person might row all night yet remain in the same place, never truly entering the domain of silence. Some cultures or individuals prefer devotion, finding the idea of literal silence less appealing. Devotion can fill the mind and heart with reverence, adoration, or love directed toward a chosen divine ideal. Rather than focusing on shutting out all thoughts, a person in a devotional mode channels them into prayer, chanting, or worship. The effect can be equally powerful. The noise of worldly concerns and petty desires is overshadowed by a higher love. In that sense, devotion also becomes a route toward the same silence. One might say it is a silence filled with sacred emotion, which eventually leads to quietude of self-centered thinking. Non-dual approaches add another layer. According to certain texts, the ultimate nature of reality is already silence itself. At that highest level, silence is not merely the absence of external noise or mental turbulence, but rather the inherent condition of pure existence, consciousness, and bliss. Words like existence and consciousness can be misleading because they suggest discrete experiences, whereas this deeper reality is said to be beyond definition, unchanging, and without boundaries. Some textual sources call it the primal state, prior to all notions of time, space, or distinction. In metaphorical language, this primal ground is compared to the ocean, and the variety of experiences are like waves that arise and subside, never truly separate from the ocean's depths. In certain discourses, the ultimate is described as the place where distinctions between seer, process of seeing, and seen object collapse. It is akin to the insight that occurs in dreams. While dreaming, a person believes one is the dreamer, seeing objects, interacting with people. Upon awakening, one realizes all were manifestations of the same mind. Extending that analogy, some interpret the waking world similarly, stating that the difference between subject, object, and means of knowledge is comparable to illusions of separation. If that is so, then the real underlying existence is always one, still and indivisible. That single reality, in the language of these non-dual teachings, is utter silence. Activity may swirl on the surface, but it does not shake the inherent stillness. A key distinction appears between meditative silence and this non-dual silence. Meditative silence typically arises when the mind is controlled, breath is regulated, senses are withdrawn, and the body remains motionless. Non-dual silence, however, is said to exist whether a person is active or inactive, whether speaking or quiet, whether thinking or resting in deep absorption. This deeper silence is the stable ground that never changes, even though the mind, body, and environment remain dynamic. Some suggest that it can be recognized in the thick of daily life by looking inward and noticing the presence that underlies every thought, emotion, or action. That presence is said to be unmovable, always silent in essence, because it is not bound by the flux of experiences. Any mention of bliss in these texts is sometimes misunderstood as a fleeting emotional high. Instead, it refers to a fundamental completeness or freedom from all limitation. The example is given of an endless expanse beyond shape or measure. Such an expanse does not struggle with being too small or overshadowed. An unlimited ground has nothing to fear, nothing to gain, and nothing to lose. Therefore, it is described as bliss, not in the sense of a passing thrill, but as the natural condition of that which is infinite and unconfined. In daily existence, a person might taste a faint reflection of this in moments of peace or joy, though these tend to be bound to particular stimuli. The tradition of silence claims that real fulfillment is discovered only when one realizes the unlimited nature of consciousness itself. That unlimited consciousness is silence. One might wonder how to reconcile these lofty notions with the necessity of living in the world, where constant tasks, responsibilities, and social interactions demand words, mental engagement, and occasionally even loud expressions. The reconciliation is found in the perspective that practical functioning can continue without disturbing the underlying stillness. A person anchored in this silent dimension can speak kindly, act decisively, and engage wholeheartedly, all while recognizing that none of it ultimately harms or alters the deeper ground. In that way, silence does not have to conflict with life's outward expressions. Instead, it supports them, ensuring they do not spiral into needless turbulence. A helpful illustration might be drawn from natural settings. A country known for its lakes may have large bodies of water that appear glassy on a calm day, reflecting the sky with utter clarity. When wind or storms come, the water churns and breaks into small waves, but deep below, the stillness remains. The surface can shift repeatedly, yet the depths do not lose their quiet stability. Similarly, the everyday mind can be disturbed by the weather of thoughts and experiences, but the essential dimension remains silent beneath it all. Some individuals find it beneficial to visit calm, natural locations precisely because the outward landscape of silence can help them sense the inward dimension more easily. Another analogy emerges through experiences of sleep or dream. In deep, dreamless sleep, the mind is not generating the usual narratives, nor is it perceiving external objects. That is a state lacking conscious mental activity, but typically one is also not aware of anything. In contemplative silence, on the other hand, one remains alert and awake, yet the mind is subdued to such an extent that the quiet ground shines through. This leads to an experience sometimes described as a state without an external or internal object, yet with clear awareness. Observers of these states emphasize that it is entirely different from dull, unconscious rest. This luminous nothingness is not a void in a negative sense, but rather a limitless fullness that defies standard concepts. Curiously, various cultures, even beyond the Hindu sphere, have recognized the power of silence as a spiritual or philosophical imperative. Some monastic communities globally practice periodic or lifelong vows of silence. While that vow might primarily address speech, the deeper goal is to cultivate mental composure. Similarly, traditions across continents highlight how too much discourse, especially argumentation or self-centered chatter, disperses mental energy and leads to confusion. Silence is valued as a means to reclaim clarity and insight. However, most of these communities also caution that simply refusing to speak is not enough, because internal dialogues can keep running rampant. True silence, they say, requires attention to the inward domain. In modern times, a growing number of retreats, personal growth programs, and wellness practices recommend regular periods of quiet. Individuals who temporarily give up phones, social media, and excessive socializing often discover a new sense of calm. They realize that so much of their anxiety or stress arises from unrelenting mental noise, fed by continual engagement with external stimuli. A short digital detox or silent retreat can spark a glimpse into deeper stillness. Yet many notice that once they return to their everyday environment, the old patterns reassert themselves unless they have developed a more stable habit of inner silence. That is why consistent daily or weekly practices are often encouraged, allowing one to keep reconnecting with the still core. Some also emphasize that the highest expression of silence does not remain static. It transforms perceptions, relationships, and creative endeavors. A person who has touched the silent ground is sometimes described as calmer, more empathic, or more discerning in daily interactions. Paradoxically, that person can be quite active in the world, even talkative when needed, because the speech and actions spring from a place of equilibrium. The internal restful dimension is not violated by outward movement. This phenomenon is occasionally described by metaphors such as action in stillness or stillness in action. All these discussions converge on a central insight, that beyond the moral, mental, and contemplative forms of silence, there is a final or absolute silence, pure existence, consciousness, bliss, untroubled by time, unconfined by space, and unshaken by events. Non-dual philosophy suggests that each individual fundamentally is that silent presence, even now, though overshadowed by the illusions of identity with body and mind. Hence the famous statements that proclaim how each being is ultimately identical with the infinite source. These statements are not merely conceptual beliefs, but are seen as pointers, invitations to look deeply into one's own nature until the noise recedes. However, a question might arise: if that is already who everyone is, why is it not perceived at all times? Some interpretations explain that it is because the mind is so continually fixated on external engagements and on the sense of being a separate person that the abiding ground remains unnoticed. The path of silence, through ethical refinement, concentration, love, insight, or a combination thereof, gradually helps the mind to relax its grip and let the deeper reality manifest. Once recognized, it is never truly lost. Even if daily hustle returns, the underlying knowledge that everything arises from and returns to silence is said to remain. One might ask what new information could be added to such a discussion. In contemporary circles, certain psychological studies show that regular silent meditation can reshape neural pathways, enhancing mental health and resilience. There is a growing interest in how purposeful quiet time can foster interpersonal harmony. Groups who practice collective silence sometimes find heightened understanding among members, as if the usual clamor of opinions relaxes and genuine listening emerges. Some people also experiment with silent days in the workplace, noticing how efficiency or creativity might increase when everyone focuses inward rather than constantly chattering. These practical applications reflect how the principle of silence, while pointing ultimately to a transcendent reality, also has very tangible benefits for everyday life. Moreover, the concept of silence can expand beyond the mental realm into an ecological or cultural dimension. There are calls to preserve silent natural spaces as a resource crucial to human well-being. Excessive noise pollution in urban environments is correlated with stress and health problems. Communities that value quiet find that they experience more reflective living. Cultural traditions of honoring sacred spaces with minimal noise or building quiet zones in public libraries serve as minor but meaningful steps toward preserving something intangible yet precious, a capacity for stillness. Such approaches might not immediately reveal the non-dual ground, but they create conditions that reduce the outward and inward disturbances that so often dominate modern existence. All told, whether from a vantage of moral living, service, devotion, or meditation, the notion of silence carries a similar thread. It points to a freedom from entanglement with incessant mental chatter and restless desire. In its deepest sense, non-dual accounts say it is the very essence of who each one truly is. While many require structured practice, like focusing on a sacred sound, abiding in quietness at dawn, or adopting a vow of gentle speech, these are all steps toward recognizing that the silence was never truly absent. It was overshadowed by layers of external and internal noise. A time may come when a person who has practiced these ideas thoroughly no longer sees a tension between words and silence, activity and stillness, because the unwavering silence remains at the core of all expression. That presence is as present in the midst of conversation as it is in the depths of solitary meditation. Words can flow from that source without eclipsing it. And when words are not necessary, the simple radiance of silent being can shine unobstructed. This, in essence, might be what certain non-dual masters mean when they say the ultimate teaching is silence, and all else is just a prologue. It is a reminder that beneath every pursuit, philosophical, religious, or practical, there awaits a final clarity that arises only when the mind's chatter yields to the silent truth of existence.